Hello, one and all, and welcome to Chronicles of Clarity. I am Michael Goff, and if this is your first visit or one of many, thank you for stopping by. I trust you had a great end of the year last year. I know I did, and now we will see what 2024 brings. And what better way to start 2024 than to hear Jordan Peterson and John Lennox discuss transcendent morality? And how is it grounded? That's the big question. Or how I like to refer to it as the reality of morality. And with no further ado, let's listen to Jordan Peterson and John Lennox.
So that knowing good and evil. So I think the Luciferian temptation is part of that offering of becoming as gods is to offer to people the possibility of defining good and evil as subjective creatures, right? So the prohibition that God places on humanity in Genesis is to not eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's a very complicated narrative trope. But one of the, in what would you say, the connotations, right? The implications is that there are moral guidelines that are absolute, that aren't within the human realm of the knowledge. It's partly the knowledge, the ability to manipulate, the ability to change or even to define. The fundamental moral propositions are transcendent and axiomatic, and they're not in the proper domain of human maneuvering. It's something like that. And the serpent says to man, no, you can take it all. You can have full knowledge even of the moral axioms. And that seems to be something that's, what would you say? That's off limits if the game of being itself is to progress without catastrophe.
Yeah,
it's something like that.
I think it's exactly like that. Because what is interesting about Genesis is that the first encounter we have with morality in the pages of Genesis, morality is defined not horizontally between humans, but vertically between humans and God. And that's crucial. It's God that defines it ultimately. So there is a transcendence from the very beginning. And it's the loss of that transcendence that we're seeing damaging our culture today, because we've lost that common sense of values that, however distorted it has been over the centuries, that we did owe to the biblical tradition. And now we wander in total confusion. And it interests me greatly that the pressure, particularly on young people today, is to look inside for answers to these questions, when what we need to be teaching them is, no, look outside and have your mind open to the fact that transcendence is real, and that there is a God and there is something bigger. There's something more than materialism is giving you.
Okay, so let's take that apart a bit. You could imagine that there could be three sources of moral knowledge. That's the kind of knowledge that orients you in the world. And one source could be the subjective. Now, we've already talked about the limitations there, is that, well, you don't live very long, and what the hell do you know? And what do you mean by the subjective, like which part of you? And then there's the danger of elevating yourself to the status of final moral arbiter, which is a kind of Luciferian presumption. Okay, so those seem like bad pitfalls. The next objection, you might say, is like, okay, well, you can't do it just subjectively. I am who I am, which is certainly the proclamation in our culture. You could do it by consensus, and that's more the view that, well, the group gets together and sort of decides by general agreement what right and wrong is, and that can shift with time and place. But as long as everybody is willing to abide by the same principles, then we can define them canonically as good or as good. But the problem with that is you run...
Yeah, go on. There's a huge problem with that. You tell me what your problem with it is, and then I'll tell you mine.
Well, my problem with that is the Nazi Germany problem.
Exactly.
It's like, well, what the hell happens when the whole herd stampedes towards hell? If you're a consensus person and there's nothing else there, it's like, well, there's no hell. That's consensus. And so the consensus by definition is right. And so if everyone decides that no Jews would be better, who the hell are you to stand in the way? And, if you're willing to stand up and say, well, you should stand in the way, well, right. So upon what grounds do you make that claim? Because it's not merely subjective. So that brings us back to the problem of transcendent morality. Okay, so you were going to talk about the problems of consensus.
Yeah? Yes, it's exactly right. That is the problem with utilitarianism. Treating others as you want them to treat you and by consensus is fine if you've got equal centers of power. If you've got a whole lot of equal centers of power vying with one another, then you can say, if you don't do this, I won't do that. But the very interesting thing about the case in point you mentioned, Nazi Germany, Hitler, in his political youth, made treaties, but he tore them up once he had the power. And if people say, you shouldn't do that, he said, what do you mean you shouldn't? I've got the power. So it doesn't answer the question, why ought you to go with the herd and murder so many Jews? And that's a huge weakness. It's all right if you're dividing ice cream among children, then utilitarianism is fine. Give an equal amount to all of them or you'll be in trouble. But at the higher level, it's shot through with this problem of the total absence of any transcendence. The oughtness has to come from above.
Lots to unpack there. Let's start with what Jordan calls transcendent morality. Jordan argues that transcendent morality is an axiomatic reality. It isn't, so to speak, left up to us humans to invent. And by axiomatic, Peterson means it is how we operate and how reality really is. Moral transcendence is therefore outside of ourselves. And in the Judeo-Christian worldview, morality is defined by God. And Lennox points out, our first encounter with morality in the Bible is not shared between two humans, Adam and Eve, for instance, but rather between Adam and God. And that is a pointer to us, the created beings, the creation of God. It announces to us that our moral failures, although they affect other people, they primarily are against God's transcendence and value. And in Christianity, we call that missing of moral perfection, literally to say missing the mark, sin. And in our society today, we reject this idea of transcendent morality. Sayings like you be you and you have your truth and I'll have mine leaves the realm of transcendent morality and now moves it into the realm of subjectivism or subjective morality. Well, what's the problem with subjective morality? Well, Jordan lays out a case against it. He says, one, we don't live long enough to know enough about the world and how reality really is. And subjective morality is bereft of a measuring stick we can use to say when, say, you or I have gone too far. And it falls into this consensus mentality. Now, as Lennox points out, there is some use of this kind of adjudication in the realm of, say, giving kids ice cream. He uses that example. And I would imagine he would agree with the idea of making laws. We vote, which is a consensus mentality in which we make a law that says we will not allow people in society to do this thing, whatever that might be. And because all laws are a restriction to some level on moral choices, that seems like a consensus mechanism. But Jordan points out that if you allow that utilitarian subjectivism to take the place of transcendent morality, then the full end of that error, due to the wickedness of men, which the Bible says we are born inherently sinful, Jordan makes the claim that then you get 1941 Nazi Germany. You get a Hitler, which is the end result of planting moral subjectivism. And then once it grows, the harvest is death and destruction. It's usually here, though, when someone objects and says, well, we would never allow another Hitler, and we would never stand for that. Hitler, of course, should have never done what he did. He ought not have done that. But this is the point that Jordan is making. Where does this sense of oughtness come from? If there is no transcendent moral standard, This just seems like it's planted in midair. And of course, this is the problem with the naturalistic, atheistic worldview when it comes to morality or moral reality that is not grounded. Because one cannot ground the idea that they ought to do something rather than something else unless there's some kind of standard. But again, if it's subjective, there is no standard, right? That's the whole argument. You need something outside of us to measure what is right and wrong. You can only assert that from your point of view. You think the person ought not do something because you think it's morally wrong. But in subjective morality, you could never say what the person was doing it was actually objectively wrong. In John 18 in the New Testament, Jesus stands before Pilate and he makes this audacious claims. Jesus said in verse 37, "Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." In which Pilate responds in verse 38 with, "What is truth?" That same question is what we face today. What is truth? If truth does not come from outside of us, this transcendence that they're talking about, then it cannot be really truth. Rather, it's just our subjective view of the world and how we think it should be. And in the end of that view ends in catastrophe. As Jordan said, if the whole consensus of society says we need to plunge ourselves into hell, since there is no God, society says, and since there's no literal hell, society says, what does it matter? It doesn't. Rather, just let me take what's mine for now, and I will declare that to be true, and above all else, good for me. Which is today the primary default of society, a subjective moral standard, which is in reality no actual standard at all. Well, let me know what you think. Do you think that transcendence of morality exists? Do you disagree, or do you agree with moral transcendence? I want to know your thoughts, so please leave a comment. I believe the moral argument for God's existence, which this ties into, is the most compelling to show that indeed God does exist. Please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps grow the channel. You all have blown me away with the support, and I look forward to diving deep in 2024. Be sure to check out some of my other videos, as I have a mix of some cultural reflections and some theological reflections that I offer you for further investigation that perhaps might catch your eye. So until next time, again, I'm Michael Goff. You've been watching Chronicles of Clarity, where we're here to clarify for you. Have a great day.